Hello, I'm Mark Ranella, editor at Harvard Business Publishing, and I'm joined by Harvard Business School professor Dick Vietor. During this podcast, we'll talk about contemporary China, its economy, its geopolitical ambitions, as well as its current relations with the United States. Most importantly, we'll learn how Professor Vietor teaches this subject at Harvard Business School. Professor Vietor is a member of the Business, Government, and International Economy Department of Harvard Business School. He's been at HBS for more than 40 years. He's published 10 books and has written more than 160 case studies, many in the field of energy, but also on many other topics: transportation, telecommunications, financial services, and the national development strategies of a dozen countries. One of his most recent HBS cases is called China, the New Normal, and was updated just this last May. Professor Vietor, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm glad to.
During this discussion, I'd like to take advantage of your expertise to explore three broad areas. First, some advice for instructors on how to best teach China, especially through the case method. Second, we'll discuss many of the major points about China that you bring up in classroom discussion. And finally, we'll explore the topic of how best to ease tensions between China and the U.S. during this difficult period in their relations. And first, I'd like to start with a little background on how you first became interested in studying and teaching about China.
Well, in the Biggie course, which is a required course at HBS, we didn't have a China scholar, and China was beginning to be pretty important along about 1978 or so.
Mm-hmm.
I had the opportunity to do one executive program over in Shanghai, and I realized that we were completely missing out on a revolution that was happening in China. So I decided to go ahead and do a case. I arranged the interviews, and I've done most of our China cases ever since then, until the most recent one, when one of my colleagues did a case on the trade war.
Could you just talk about that visit to Shanghai and how you reacted to it?
We took a group of executives over there, and we took a bus into Shanghai from outside of Shanghai. And the buildings just kept getting larger and larger and larger. This went on for 45 minutes.
Really?
And I was sitting next to a senior executive, and his mouth was just hanging open, as was mine. We couldn't believe what we were seeing.
Right.
And this was
This is a long time ago.
just 20 years ago.
Right.
And now, I mean, it's completely different. I was there 2 years ago, and it's just unbelievable.
Right. Let's get into some pedagogical questions about how you teach about China. So just put yourself in the shoes of a professor who's going to teach about China the first time. What are some do's and don'ts you'd recommend?
Well, I suppose reading something about China's history would be one thing one might consider.
Right.
But certainly, I teach about China in the post-Mao era,
Mm-hmm.
and you just can't teach everything. There are just too many really interesting, really important things going on. So you need to sort of select what it is that you're teaching. You're not really teaching fully about China.
Right.
That's one point. For sure, you have to make clear how fast China has grown. People don't realize that China's grown at almost 11% a year since 1978. No country in the world has ever done that. And it's especially unique because they've got 1 billion people.
Right.
I mean, now they've got 1.4 billion, and they've still managed to do that up until about 2013 when they began to slow down a little bit. So it's a spectacular growth story. And the other point that's important is that rapid growth, which is wonderful, creates a great many problems. And I don't think Americans realize how hard it is for the Chinese government to cope with all the problems that they have. I mean, we have a lot of problems, but they have huge problems.
I know that you talk about, in your last case, the new normal. How important is that to understand?
After the financial crisis, the Prime Minister of China, Wen Jiabao, began to realize that China had become too dependent on its trade with the United States and Europe. In other words, their whole growth model was exporting stuff to the two rich parts of the world. And when we went into financial crisis, we stopped buying, and the impact on China was huge. Maybe 100 million jobs were lost, 100 million.
Wow.
And thousands of businesses went bankrupt. They just had terrible issues that they had to face. And Wen Jiabao realized that it was time to begin refocusing the strategy on China and domestic growth rather than just on export-led growth. And he made that pretty clear in 2010. When Xi Jinping took over in 2012, one of the first things he did was basically adopt the set of policies that Wen Jiabao was recommending, and he called it the new normal.
A couple more questions about pedagogy. What topics do students tend to have trouble understanding when you're teaching China? and what topics get them really excited and interested?
Well, they do get very interested, believe it or not, in productivity, if one teaches it right. They get quite interested in military issues. But the most difficult issues, I find, even teaching to senior executives, is getting them to see the numbers. The numbers for China are unbelievable. So if you look at their national income accounts and see how low consumption is and how high investment is, I mean, it's nothing like the United States or even any other developing country. And if you look at the balance of payments, where hundreds of billions of dollars come in each year on foreign direct investment, and where they run massive, massive trade surpluses, and you look at it year after year after year growing, you begin to see the power of this incredible economy.
I know that you teach, for instance, some groups of executives from China sometimes on this topic.
Yes.
And then, of course, Western and American students. What's the difference in teaching those two groups?
Well, the Americans know next to nothing about China, and so they're surprised. Even though they've read a case, they're surprised when they organize the facts into patterns that make sense. The Chinese are very defensive, exceedingly defensive. They assume that the case is negative. They assume that the American professor doesn't like China, and they're just very defensive. And one tries to use humor, and I think you can do that fairly successfully. It's also very difficult for them to speak candidly. The Communist Party is very strong.
Right.
So if you have a group of Chinese executives here, there's a good chance that 5 or 8 of them are members of the Communist Party. And that makes the others very loath to say anything critical.
Is it the candid style of speaking that they translate as being offensive?
Yeah, but they won't. I mean, case method teaching is trying to bring out the story from them, and they're just not willing. I mean, if you want to talk, say, about corruption, the place is just viciously corrupt.
Right.
But you can't get one of them to say that.
Right.
They all know it.
What do you hope your students take away from the discussion on China? I know you just mentioned, understanding the numbers.
First, China's growth is amazing. I want them to appreciate that, not just the GDP growth, but the GDP growth, the job growth, the improvement in poverty. They've brought 600 or 800 million people out of poverty in 30 years. It's unbelievable.
That's amazing.
I want them to appreciate the fact that it's an autocratic dictatorship, and it's run by a Communist Party and some very strong presidents. Xi Jinping is almost as strong, perhaps stronger than Mao Zedong was. But Deng Xiaoping was pretty significant. So I want them to see that it's a very different form of government and form of economy, and it's very successful. In fact, it's now becoming a model for many emerging market countries, which is an unfortunate aspect of our foreign policy. We're letting that happen.
Right.
So I want them to see that. I also want them to think about how we get along. Relations with China have deteriorated It started getting worse before Trump as the Chinese have built their military. And we have issues over human rights with the Uyghurs. We have issues over Taiwan and issues over Hong Kong. But they've really sort of gone downhill of late. It's idiotic to think about any way of getting along other than getting along. We have to.
So before we move on to getting a little deeper into some China questions, you mentioned just now that China is becoming a model. Briefly, what would be that model as opposed to, say, U.S.'s model previously?
Yeah. So, I mean, America is the epitome of free market capitalism, where firms compete with each other and where the only role for government besides the military is unfair competition or to regulate what are called natural monopolies, things like utilities, or industries where there are externalities that can't be handled by competition, healthcare or pollution or safety. In China, it's just very different. The premise is that the state is responsible for economic development, not markets, not firms, the state. And so the state drives economic development intentionally. The state has its fingers in everything. The state controls 140,000 enterprises, and that's after the reforms that occurred in the late 1990s. And the state uses every trick it can imagine to help those firms. So state enterprises losing money, it subsidizes. It has differential tariffs that will help firms export more without having to worry about internal competition. And lots of countries do this. Lots of Latin American countries have done it. Lots of African countries have done it. But China has really shown how this developmental state should work. I mean, the Soviet Union did this for years, but they did it terribly.
Right.
China has pulled off the exact opposite. And one reason is because the Communist Party and the Politburo and the president of China is so powerful. They can really control things.
So just a quick question then, and when you're talking about the state pushing economic development, in the U.S. there's often people pointing to entrepreneurs.
Yes.
So if you're a person with an entrepreneurial mindset in China, where do you get your work done, or how do you get your work done?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. Because of the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, there's now a huge private sector in China. Again, it's a private sector that the state accommodates, because that's where the growth comes from. So there's lots of entrepreneurial capital available in China, and there are thousands of very aggressive entrepreneurs. And they will often use the tools of government to forward their own initiatives.
Right.
But many of the firms that are the biggest exporters are not the state enterprises that are sort of the dogs.
Right.
They're these hotshots that have built billion-dollar enterprises that are incredible.
Okay, so the state's power is part of their company's, strategic options in a way. I see. Okay. It's sort of like the way Juan Trippe built airlines or airports across the Pacific, right?
Yes,
right.
some time ago.
In Pan Am, right? Okay. All right. When people talk about China today, the first thing they think about often right now, unfortunately, is this trade war, this trade conflict. So was this sharp conflict inevitable, or could it have been avoided?
For sure, it could be avoided because it has been avoided for 2.5 decades. It was this president that chose to do it. Now, had the problem gotten worse? Yes. Our bilateral trade deficit with China has reached a high point last year of $419 billion. That's with one country.
Right.
Our total current account deficit is 488. So
wow.
The problem has clearly gotten worse. But we say it's a problem. It's a very good thing in some ways for Americans. We get cheap goods, which we can't make. The wages in China are $5 or $6. Our wages average $27 in the United States. We can't make shirts. We can't put computers together. We
Right.
can design computers, but we can't put them together, which they can do so much cheaper.
Uh-huh.
So we get all these cheap goods, which have made Americans richer. It holds our inflation rate down, and it holds our interest rates down because of all the money that we give China for the goods. They loan that money back to us because we run huge trade and fiscal deficits. So in a lot of ways, this is a good thing for the United States. However, in many ways, it's a bad thing. I mean, we have lost perhaps 3.5 to 4 million manufacturing jobs to China. We used to have television companies here. We don't anymore. We used to have sneaker companies here. We only have one now. So the jobs have moved to China. But that's a normal part of economic development. Low value-added jobs leave as a country gets richer. And indeed, now in China, they're beginning to lose their textile jobs. They're moving to Vietnam, and to Cambodia, or they're moving to Western China, which is much poorer, either way. But what we do object to is their cheating. From our point of view, it's cheating. But you see, what we talked about earlier, from their point of view, it's part of their development strategy. So if you have a steel company that is selling steel at below cost, they don't see that as a bad thing. Well, of course, it wipes out our steel companies, but it provides jobs for them. So they're willing to do that. And they do that in many of their state enterprises, in steel and aluminum and all sorts of heavy industries, cement, everything. They also steal our technology. Now, again, they were way behind us in technology, and for them it made sense. I don't quite understand enough about moral values in China. I'm not a China scholar, but they don't see anything. I mean, given the levels of corruption that we see, they just don't see anything wrong with stealing someone's technology. So Microsoft comes out with a new operating system. You know, China buys one set of it, and then there are 100 million. And a new movie comes out in the United States, and that's it. There's 100 million of them in China. And it's just all the way up to things like cars. A few years ago, I would show people a picture of a Lexus made in China, except they weren't operating in China. It was just a complete knockoff. A car.
Wow.
And it sold for almost $20,000 less than a Lexus sold for. So we worry about the technology. We worry about the theft. They have differential tariffs. One of the things that President Trump has been upset about is not allowing our firms to compete in China. Or if they're allowed to, they have to give up technology to a Chinese joint venture partner. And we just don't like that. We think, you know, after they join the WTO, the market should be open. And it's just not. So I think the issue around Trump's tariffs are President Donald Trump thought the trade imbalance was the problem, whereas most academics think that unfair trade is the problem.
I see.
And they would go after the unfair trade rather than the trade balance. Like right now, just this week, they're talking about the Chinese buying more of our agricultural products because when Trump and Xi Jinping met last week at the G20, the Chinese made some indication that they'd start buying agricultural goods. That's what Trump wanted. But see, that's not the issue. The issue is these illicit things that they do and that are not allowed by the World Trade Organization.
So it's we could run trade deficits with them for years. It would be fine.
We
it's
could.
really
and
it's
we
really,
do with Japan. And we do with Mexico. And we do with Canada. And we don't like running huge trade deficits. We'd like to be more competitive. But we're so rich, it's really hard to not run deficits with them. I mean, the other countries, Germany runs deficits with China, and it's an exporting star. But they can't compete at the low end.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was in some of the readings you pointed out when Trump was putting tariffs on Chinese goods. It was pointed out that there weren't a lot of tariffs to put on American goods from the Chinese end.
No.
Not the equivalent. So,
but see, Trump is his idea of trade. I just don't know how it developed intellectually for him.
Mm-hmm.
He's put tariffs on Mexico and on Canada, which are our two closest friends.
Mm-hmm.
He's put tariffs on steel and aluminum on the Europeans and on the Japanese.
Right.
He recently put tariffs on India,
Right.
which is a strategic foil to China.
Right.
I mean, he thinks somehow that, and as you know, he ran for office about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States.
Right.
And the evidence shows that no net manufacturing jobs have come back.
Right.
We're doing great right now, don't get me wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and our unemployment rate is very low.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that manufacturing that's gone to China
Right.
or that's gone to Mexico is coming back to the United States.
Right, and that's at the lower end of
That's
the
right.
economy anyway.
That's right.
Right, okay. So recently there's been a downward trend in China's GDP. You pointed that out in your case. So what are the reasons behind this, and especially what are the implications?
Yeah, so again, we see this with all countries. When they get really rich, it's harder to grow a big base.
Mm.
So the Chinese base now is, whatever it is, $15 trillion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And to grow that at the same percentage rate that it grew at 10 years ago is virtually impossible.
Right, right.
So, you expect countries to slow. I actually have been surprised at how well China's done in the last 3 or 4 years under Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm.
I would have thought that the growth rate would have slowed to 5% by now, which is still incredible
Right, right.
for a country that big,
Right.
or even 4%, and he's still got it growing at about 6.5.
Mm-hmm.
He set a target when he took over in 2012 of growing the economy at 6.5% a year on average, so that he could double the size of the economy by 2020. And that has persisted.
Wow.
It's slowing a little bit in the last year more than I think Xi Jinping would want. And what he's doing is he uses credit and credit formation to pour money into the economy to build infrastructure and whatnot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that keeps their economy growing very, very fast.
Okay.
I mean, if our government were pouring that much money into the economy, we'd be growing faster as well.
Right.
But we'd also be broke.
Right. So this might be a good segue to talk more about the new normal, as we mentioned before, and its role in this economy.
Yeah. So the new normal is really, as I said, I think it comes out of Wen Jiabao's realization that China had been very successful exporting to rich countries, but it had become very dependent on those rich countries. And in fact, those rich countries, the United States and Europe, are not necessarily bosom pals
Right.
of a communist China.
Right.
And so I think he also realized that there were a huge number of poor people in Western China, and there was a gigantic opportunity. Instead of selling washing machines in the United States, sell washing machines, a cheaper version of the washing machines, to poor people who've never seen a washing machine or a television set or electricity or so forth. If you look at the numbers, one of the things you see is that China's level of consumption was down at about 35% of the GDP
Right.
is consumed. To put that in comparison, the United States is 69.
Wow.
So we're double. I mean, we're much more than double because we're much richer. But as a share of our output, we consume twice as much. And he realized that you can grow the economy by growing consumption,
Right.
not just by growing exports.
Right.
So I think his thinking was export somewhat less. Still, we want to have a surplus, and you still want to keep growing, but just not as much. And also, investment was what was really driving China. The government was investing 44% of GDP, the government and the private sector. And the foreign sector. Remember, huge amount of foreign direct investment has been pouring into China since 1997 or so. All that investment in cities, in electric utilities, in highways, in rail systems, in ports, and so forth, that's really pushed their economy to grow. So the new normal was to shift away from the heavy investment, not a lot, but just some, and shift away from the reliance on exports over imports and shift more of it to consumption.
Okay.
So in other words, consumption might rise, say, from 35 to 45% over 10 or 15 years. And investment might drop from 44 to 35, which is still unbelievable.
Right.
We invest 17%. And one of the things you can see if you look at the balance of payments is that about 7 or 8 years ago, exports and imports together as a portion of GDP added up to twice what they add up to now as a portion of GDP.
Wow.
In other words, they haven't shrunk in absolute terms, but as a share of the economy, which has been growing at 6.5%,
Right.
they've shrunk by half.
Wow.
And they've also shifted a bit. A lot more of their imports are from Asian suppliers that provide the inputs to their finished products. So they get all the electronics from South Korea and from Taiwan, and then they assemble the computer. We
Gotcha.
design it. They make the components.
Right.
China does the assembly.
Wow.
And
Interesting.
it's an amazing story. So that's the heart of the new normal. The second part of the new normal was that the only thing China could do was manufacture, and their service sector was terrible. And services in advanced countries are much, much larger than manufacturing. I mean, it's 80% in the United States, or almost 90. So they wanted to begin improving their service sector, which includes lots of things. Their health care had fallen apart.
Right.
Their pension system had fallen apart. They have no tourism. People don't go to China to hang out.
Right.
So there were lots of service sectors that they wanted to really improve. So that's the second part of the new normal, services. And then there were a whole bunch of problems that had developed that they wanted to fix. The environment was a mess. Energy was a problem. They wanted to curtail some of the debt. They wanted to fix the state enterprises. And he wanted to get rid of corruption, which he's made a lot of progress.
Really?
He's executed many, many people.
Oh.
He's jailed thousands and thousands of people for corruption, but he's got a long way to go.
Right. So, Dick, you often point to 9 problems or issues that are particularly important facing China right now. Many of them the result of growth, and I'd like to go over them one by one. The first one you point out is the bilateral trade surplus, which we've talked about a little bit. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I would just add that President Trump has now imposed a lot of very expensive tariffs on China. Washing machines, the price has gone up almost $100 a unit. Solar panels, steel and aluminum, and then $250 billion worth of tariffs on other things. And he raised those tariffs to 25% last May.
Right.
And that's where we stand right now with no negotiations going on, although an agreement to start negotiating again next week. This is costing Americans a lot because it's Americans that have to pay the tariff because prices go up.
Right.
And it's costing China a lot. China's not importing soybeans, so the price of soybeans has fallen by about 30%. And China's buying its soybeans from Brazil and Australia. And in the long run, that'll mean that our farmers have lost their sales contacts with China on soybeans.
That's key, right? Because
Yes.
these things take years to develop.
Exactly. And that's exactly what's happening. And it's similar in many sectors. There are certain kinds of metal that we buy from China that are used in particular products, and they can't find a replacement. So they've stopped making them. So I don't know what the cost is to the United States. I've seen one study about 6 months ago that said it was $60 billion. It for sure is more than that now, but I have no idea how much. It's for sure costing China because their growth is beginning to slow,
Right.
and they're having to pay premiums to Brazil or to Australia or whoever for the stuff they are importing.
Right.
So this is a very costly way to solve a trade dispute.
You also point to some problems related to demographics in
Oh,
China,
yes.
right? Can you describe some of them?
Yeah, so China, because its population was so large, adopted 30 years ago a two-child policy. And they got their fertility rate down, but that wasn't enough. And so then under Deng Xiaoping, they adopted a one-child policy. And they drove the fertility rate down to about 1 or 1.1%. And the way it was implemented was not pleasant. There were forced sterilizations of women and lots of abortions. So they got the fertility rate down, and then they realized that they'd gotten it so low that they weren't producing enough kids to come into the workforce. But by the time they realized that, it was 10 or 15 years too late. So then, around 2011, they immediately changed the policy so that if both your parents were one-child parents, you could have a second child. And then a year later, they just changed it and said, hell, you can have two children. So it's a two-child policy now.
Okay.
And the fertility rate's hardly budged. It's going to take years before people's behavior begins to change.
Right.
Well, what does this mean? It means that in the next 20 or 30 years, there'll be about 240 million people retiring. That's 250 million people retiring, and there'll only be 12 kids to do the work.
Right.
And so they're going to have the kinds of problems that the United States and most European countries already have, the imbalance between the youth working and elderly people who are getting older because healthcare is improving, having their pensions and their healthcare paid for.
Right.
Except it's going to be 10 times as bad in China because they're so much bigger and because they've forced it through the one-child policy. You know, most countries in the world have their fertility rates going down, and some of the developing countries have gone down sharply, but they've gone down from like 5 to 3 or 5 to 2. China's down at 1.2 or 1.3 now. The replacement rate is 2.08. So they're nowhere near the replacement rate. Nor should they probably be, because they don't want to have 1.8 billion people. But they don't want to have this huge imbalance. The other problem that I would just throw in, China is a male-oriented society, and so the advent of ultrasound have made an imbalance very easy between men and women. So
people have been choosing not to have
people
girls.
choose not to have girls, and it's quite a significant imbalance in China. It is in India, even worse, but it's significant. So you get a lot of males, 24-year-old males that can't find a girlfriend, and that's not a healthy.
That's not a healthy society.
In a city or anywhere else. So that's an issue
that's
that
bad.
They've got to manage.
Well, and there's also income equality to deal with.
So this is that you would think this would be the last place where you would have income inequality. It's a stone-cold communist country, but the income inequality is outrageous in China. So I checked on the numbers this morning. Last year there were 1.2 million millionaires in China, which is a lot when the average is $10,000. There are 476 billionaires.
Wow.
So there are more billionaires in China than any country in the world except the United States.
Wow.
And the difference between someone driving a Maserati in Shanghai versus a peasant using a stick and a goat to plow his fields in Western China is really remarkable. The Gini index there is about 0.5, which is really awful. It's worse than the United States, which is a capitalist country. And some Chinese scholars think that the Gini index is about 0.6, which would make it almost as bad, say, as South Africa.
Wow.
So, a lot of rich people, a lot of poor people, and this makes it harder to govern. It makes it harder to do things. If you're going to build a new dam, you have to move, 1 million poor people out of the way, and it's just, it's not a healthy situation.
Are there cultural problems that, like the East doesn't like the West and they don't care about them. It's sort of that kind of divide.
Among other things, it leads to massive amounts of migration, right? So there's just a huge amount of migration from rural Western areas to urban, trying to find half-decent jobs.
Right.
One of the problems is their hukus. Mao Zedong created this hukou system, which was a permit that showed where you lived, and the permit would allow you to buy food at the state food store and to have your children go to the school and so forth and to get a pension.
Right.
And your hukou doesn't move.
Right.
But if several 100 million people have moved, their hukou is still back home.
Oh.
So you've got men working in Shanghai whose families are back in wherever.
Right.
And the families can't come.
Wow.
Because the kids can't go to school. So they're trying to fix that. They're in the process of trying to fix that, but that'll take years also to fix.
Wow. With China growing, there's environmental problems. And so I know this could be another podcast probably, but
this is where I started working on China back in the 1980s with folks across the river at Harvard. They have huge environmental problems. The problem that we care about internationally the most, of course, is air pollution. China and the United States were emitting the same amount of carbon in 2006. China is now emitting 33% more than the United States. China is by far the largest emitter of carbon dioxide. Their energy resource is primarily coal. They have very little natural gas, no petroleum to speak of. So they burn coal at old power plants. The carbon goes up, sulfur dioxide goes up, nitrogen dioxide. They're all greenhouse gases. And it creates, terrible health problems. I read somewhere that about 8% of all deaths 2 years ago were air pollution related in China, which is a huge number.
Right.
Now, they know that, and they're working as hard as they can to clean it up. But when you've got thousands of coal-fired power plants, it's just very hard to clean it up. They're building nuclear plants as fast as they can. They're world leaders in wind and in solar, but
catching up
it's going to take a long, long time. So in the Paris Agreement, for instance, they've agreed to stop growing their carbon emissions by the year 2030. In other words, everybody else is reducing theirs except India and China, and China is going to cap its in 2030, which is not good for the world.
No.
I mean, it's the best China can do, but
it's not good.
Of course, this is why Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. He said, we're giving up too much to the Chinese.
Right.
But they also have water problems. So the water is not where people are and where industry is. So they're moving water from the southwest to the northeast in canals and huge pipelines. They're drawing in saline water up in the northeast in the industrial cities. The water is foul. You just can't grow at 11% a year and have 1 billion people without
these kinds of consequences, right?
We had these consequences back in the 50s and 60s, and we only had 100 million people, and we were only growing at 4 or 5%.
Right.
So the problems are just like any industrial country, but 10 times worse. Soil is got the toxic metals in it. Plants blow up all the time, and chemical plants because they're badly regulated. They're deforesting significant parts of Western China, which allows the Gobi Desert to move even faster towards China. So it's a major challenge for the Chinese, and they know that. They've known it since, I'd say, 2010, and they're trying to address it, but it's not easy.
So I imagine millions and millions of people are affected by this. They know that it's connected to industrialization.
Yes.
Does this create, unrest and problems, or
Absolutely.
no?
Yes, it does, and especially around these plants and the water. The air, people can't take responsibility for the air, but for a local chemical plant that's emitting toxics into the water and the soil, people get very upset about that. There are constant riots, environmental riots in China.
There are.
Absolutely. And like when they built that huge dam.
Oh, the Three Gorges?
The Three Gorges Dam, and had to move 1 million people away. And to make matters worse, although it's an incredible engineering feat, it's going to silt up very, very fast because of the nature of the river.
Right.
They just didn't pay attention to that. So they're going to have to work very hard. And see, his growth strategy conflicts with an environmental strategy
Right.
to a significant degree.
Right.
He would rather build a steel mill
Right.
than clean the air from a steel mill.
Right. So just out of curiosity, but when there's unrest, does that lead to change, though? I mean, you get riots and nothing?
So that's a great question. I think 10 years ago, I taught that 40 or 50,000 local disturbances a year were going to force the government to change.
Right.
I was wrong. This government is too strong. Xi Jinping has strengthened the government. He's got total control over the military. I have read that the internal security budget is larger than the defense budget.
Wow.
And you can see what he's doing to the Uyghurs in Western China. I mean, he's sent 2 million of them now to schools to reform their brains. And there's nothing they can do about that.
Right. Okay, well, corollary to the environmental problems is natural resources. Of course, they need them.
They sure do.
And they don't have them all in China.
No,
Right.
the one thing they have are rare earths.
Right.
They've monopolized rare earths, essentially, and are thinking about using that as a trade weapon against the United States. But the big resources, iron ore, copper, oil, natural gas, they don't have. I mean, they've got some oil. They produce a couple million barrels a day, but they're consuming 12 million. And all the other metals that industrial societies need, they just don't have enough of. So they have, in about 1997 and 98, the government decided on what is called a going out strategy. There are two ways you could deal with shortage. You could either buy the stuff, or you can go and invest and develop it yourself. And they decided to do that for security reasons. So their 3 national oil companies went out and bought assets. Of course, they couldn't buy assets where Western companies already were. So they had to go to less attractive places,
Right.
Which they have done, mostly in Africa.
Okay.
And they've spent billions and billions of dollars developing mines and oil fields and gas fields in Africa, and some in Latin America, and some in Canada. Their biggest single investment was the acquisition of Nexen, which was a Canadian energy company that they bought for $14 billion.
Wow. Right.
At any rate, they've invested a lot abroad. It's been a very expensive strategy. And I think there's a plus and a minus to this. The minus is that it's done nothing for security, because all their oil has to go through the Straits of Malacca, which are controlled by the United States Navy.
Right.
So it's no more secure than if they were just buying it on the spot market.
Right.
Now, the good news is that they have developed a foreign policy now that's very aggressive in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which Xi Jinping has done to develop 60 countries between China and Europe. And that's going very well. And they've convinced a lot of countries, I think, that China is their friend, and that China will pump resources into the country, and that China's development strategy is the right model.
Right. This is a bit of a trivial observation for my part, but I remember seeing just the other day a Netflix series set in Mexico, and there were 2 laborers there talking and having trouble getting jobs, and one says, well, there's got to be one from the Chinese, right? So I mean, that seems to be like an anecdotal indicator of how broadly they're affecting economies all over the place.
Yes, and, that's also the downside, though. They have so many of their workers abroad that it does irritate the host countries. So there are more than 1 million Chinese building dams and schools and town halls in southern Africa. And Africans are a little bit pissed off about that,
Right.
because they'd like the jobs.
Oh, I see.
But the Chinese bring their own people in. They don't integrate at all. And it's just...
It's an irritant, yeah.
And it's not always clear that they're getting the highest quality road or rail system or
Right.
whatever, but they're getting
You're getting something.
which they wouldn't be able to do themselves.
Right. So state-owned enterprises are a big part of the Chinese economy. You describe them as being weak right now, or maybe they've always been that way.
Yeah.
What's their impact on the growth in China?
Well, again, I mentioned there are huge numbers still of state-owned enterprises. There are 127 very large groups that are collectively owned or controlled by the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, for instance, all 3 of the oil companies are part of that, all 5 of the power grids, the 4 biggest steel companies, Chalco, the big aluminum company, 2 of the big automobile companies, at any rate, on and on and on, the airlines. They're all state enterprises. And as you know, the problem with state enterprises, they're not being driven by competition.
Right.
So they tend to not make as much money as the private sector does. And there's quite a sharp divide in China between these state enterprises, which might make, if they don't lose money, which many of them do, and they have to borrow from the state-owned banks, if they don't lose money, they might make 2 or 3% return on sales, whereas the private sector should be making 15, 18, 20%.
Right.
So it's really it's a big drain. But the other problem with it is, to the extent that those companies export, they're subsidized, and an American steel company could barely compete with a Chinese steel company.
Right.
If it weren't being subsidized, because the wages are so much lower.
Right.
Although the transportation's huge.
Right.
But when they're subsidized on top of that, we just can't compete. They
Right.
have more than 50% of the world's steel capacity in
Wow.
China. And
I did
Xi
not know
Jinping
that.
wanted to close some of it. He'll order some province to close this steel mill, and they'll just ignore it. They don't want to close it because it's all their jobs.
Right.
Or close these mines.
Right,
Well, it's
right.
all their jobs.
Right. Does this fall under the WTO or anything like that? I mean, is there any resolute? Yes,
Yes,
it does.
and
It should.
And the Chinese often ignore this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So we've brought dozens and dozens of dumping cases
Mm-hmm.
against China. But dumping's tricky because you have to show that they're selling it below home market prices.
Right.
Well, they can also be giving it away at home, especially if it's, say, steel, which goes into other products that they then sell, like cars.
Oh, I see.
So the WTO has been not much use to the United States since 2001.
Right. Wow.
Part of the new normal is to fix these, but not fix them the way other countries have by privatizing. He wants to corporatize them. In other words, he wants to make them more like firms.
Oh, I see.
Give them more of a private board of directors and so forth. It's really hard to do that if it's fundamentally owned by the state.
Right.
But he understands that these companies need to be fixed. It's just how to do it without privatizing them is hard. I mean, the Europeans just privatize them all.
Right.
And that's fix them.
Right.
They've either gone broke or they make money.
Right.
But he can't do that.
So we'll go to another point of conflict, and this you mentioned earlier was the South China Sea.
Yeah.
So why has that arisen lately?
That's
And what are the risks associated with that?
You know that international law, you have control 3 miles out, and your preferential area is 200 miles out. The Chinese, based on, 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, have drawn something called the 9-dash line,
Right.
which basically runs from outside of Taiwan down along the edge of the Philippines, down to almost Malaysia, and all the way around Borneo and back to Malaysia and Singapore. And they've said that's ours. Now, there are reasons for that. They think there's a lot of oil there.
Right.
And there's a lot of fish and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But what they've done that is upsetting is, besides saying it's theirs, which it's not, it's open ocean,
Right.
there are a bunch of islands there, the Spratly Islands, the Parcel Islands, and Scarborough Shoal, which they have built up by importing sand and making it into a reef, into an island, and then building an air base, and then putting fighter jets there, and then putting surface-to-air missiles there.
Wow.
And the Philippines took them to international court, and the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague in July 2016 said absolutely not. This is not China's waters. China has preference out 200 miles only, but not to these islands. And the United States enforces that. The Filipinos don't have the nerve to enforce it.
Right, of course.
Because they're dependent on China for capital investments. The Vietnamese, interestingly, are the ones who have been toughest.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're just saying, you're screwing us.
Right.
The Malaysians won't open their mouth. Singaporeans won't say much, and the Japanese complain, but don't. And it's the United States that's enforcing it. We're just not going to give them the entire South China Sea.
All right. Well, we got two more problems. One is debt in China, right? and
for some economists, the debt issue is the biggest long-term issue. Nobody knows how much their debt is because nobody has access to the books of all the different provinces.
Right.
But the current estimates are about 300% of GDP. This is not primarily the debt of the central government. It's got debt, but it's much less than, say, the United States or Europeans, maybe 40% of GDP or so.
Right.
But it's the private sector, which has a huge amount of debt. It's the state-owned enterprises, and a lot of their debt is dollar-denominated because they've had to buy inputs from the West.
Oh, I see.
Heavy equipment and whatnot that they've needed dollars for.
Right.
Primarily, it's the provinces, which have not gotten enough money from the federal government, so they issue debt to develop the province, to provide health care, to provide pensions or whatever. And they just keep borrowing from the state banks. And then finally, the banks are regulated because they're all government-owned. There are non-bank banks, what we used to call non-bank banks.
Right.
They're called shadow banks.
Okay.
They're private companies that loan you money. So if you're an entrepreneur and if the government is tightening credit, you can't get the money you need to start your business, you go to a shadow bank and you just pay interest rates that are three times higher.
Right.
And so the shadow banks have a huge amount of debt. So you add up all of these different forms of debt, especially the local debt, and it gets you up to about 300% of GDP. And that's a lot.
Wow.
That's way more than it is in the West.
And these shadow banks, I mean, are they sort of like a version of loan sharks?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
they are.
That's exactly what they are.
Oh, really?
And then the non-performing loans of the provinces and the state enterprises are also huge.
Right.
So that's just bad debt that has not been written off yet by the four big state-owned banks.
Right.
So there are people that worry that China's going to have a debt crisis. There are other people that say, no, China, it's got a very strong central bank, which it does, and it can control this. In other words, you could take a bond that comes due from some province, say $1 billion bond, and you could refinance that as a 30-year bond at a somewhat lower interest rate and just stretch it out for years.
I see.
So you could do lots of things. You could have some forgiveness. I used to think that they were facing a debt crisis any day now. I mean, a couple of years ago. I've seen more economists that think that they can drag this thing
weather it out for a while.
But it's a constant fight for Xi Jinping to keep the growth rate up. He's got to expand credit. And so it's the credit expansion that makes people nervous.
Right. Okay. So the last problem you talked about is technological catch-up, which is an interesting phrase. What does that mean, and what are the goals that China is setting for itself in technology?
This is another issue which I think Donald Trump doesn't get. This is called Made in China 2025. It seems to me perfectly reasonable that China wants to develop.
Right.
I mean, all countries want to do that. And it wants to move up the value-added chain and make higher value-added goods. So instead of making textiles or toys or furniture, it wants to make robots. It wants to make electronic vehicles. It wants to make advanced medical devices and export them.
Right.
And that's normal.
Makes sense, right.
And that requires, of course, modernizing your infrastructure, developing your education, doing a lot of things. All of that seems perfectly reasonable to me. Donald Trump is dead set against this. But I think the reason is that the way they do it is by cheating.
Right.
So if you steal technology for an electronic car, that's probably not a good example because they're world leaders now other than Tesla.
Oh, really? Okay.
And same with solar.
Okay.
Although with solar, they have stolen technology. With wind, they've stolen technology.
Okay.
So to the extent that they either force foreign firms to give up their technology to be there,
Right.
or they steal the technology, that's the problem.
Mm-mm-mm.
Not that they want to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody with half a brain would want to do this.
Right.
It's what the Japanese did. It's Australians did it.
Right.
Germans did it. It's what you do.
Right.
We did it. So he has demanded that they abandon Made in China 2025. They're not.
So in general, a lot of the big goals that China sets for itself are totally reasonable. It's just that the means
Yes.
to get to those goals, that's the problem.
Yes.
Right.
And it's very hard to force them to fix the means, especially when they don't see it as being bad.
Right. There's got to be a big conversation about that, essentially.
There needs to be something.
You've described a lot of the problems that China's facing, and they're very complicated, and they play a huge part in relations between the U.S. And right now, they're at a really high point of tension and lots of problems and misunderstandings. I know you want to prioritize or emphasize that we can't afford a conflict. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do to get along with China?
Yeah. This is, if you look at the Chinese military, you can see they've got ballistic missiles. They've got missiles that target aircraft carriers. They're developing hypersonic space drives. This is a serious country. And they've been a power for thousands of years, thousands. And it's only in the last 150 years when they fell apart and became a colony of the West. And they resent that, and they want to get back to the way things were. But I think they want to be dominant in their area. I don't think they, or at least I didn't up until very, very recently. Literally the last few months when relations have gotten much worse. I think they wanted to dominate Asia. They don't want to be the world the way the United States is. I'm hoping that's still the case. But either way, they're so big and they're so powerful that we cannot afford to get into a conflict with them. Another Cold War with missiles being built, nuclear missiles and whatnot, that's just crazy.
Right.
We've still got Russia to worry about, even though it's much weaker now and so forth. But China is growing and is powerful. And so we ought to get along with them.
Right. Yeah.
It's not easy to get along with them. Their values are so different. But I just think it's absolutely necessary. In fact, I don't know if you saw it. It was published last Monday. It was a letter from 100 academics criticizing Trump's China policy.
I did not see that.
And it's amazing, including several of the China scholars, including Bill Kirby here at the business school, and several of the folks at the Kennedy School of Government, and all across the country.
Right.
And it just tore into Trump's policy because it said, look, the Chinese are doing lots of nasty things. They don't have our values. It's an autocratic government. Doesn't matter. Sorry. We have to get along with them. We just have to find a way to get along with them. One way to think about this that I originally read about in the Melania Hart article is to think about what China absolutely must have. Now, you have to think a lot about Xi Jinping's political strategy and the political values of the Communist Party, what they must have. And then you need to think about what the United States must have.
Okay.
And then you can think about where is it okay for us to compete and where can we actually cooperate. What must China have? Well, I think the most obvious thing that we've been talking about is their domestic development policy. They're going to run their government to grow their economy. They've got a long way to go before they catch up with the West. And they should have that. That Most countries have that.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Domestic political control. Now, we don't like the way they do it. The guy's an autocrat. People go to jail all the time. People are executed. But that's the way they're doing it. This is not our business. We can say we don't like it, and we should.
Right.
But it's theirs to do.
Right.
The third thing is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a terrific strategy, I think.
Right.
They can now ship a container from Beijing to London on land, on rails. I commend them for their Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, they want security in the Pacific. I understand that. They're a big country in the South China Sea and the Pacific.
Right.
That's reasonable.
Right.
Access to oceans. They want to be able to get out. They're building 2 aircraft carriers. They've got one. They want to be an ocean going. I don't think they want to be in the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
I think they want to be in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean.
Right.
And they want access to markets, to our market, to Europe's market, to Russia's market, and so forth. Okay. What must the United States have? Well, first we need to secure the U.S. border from Chinese cyber espionage. They're hacking all over us, and they could do damage. They have not yet, but they could do horrific damage to our utility system. Or we've got to make that secure.
Right.
And that's up to us to make it secure. We want access to international waters, i.e. the South China Sea.
Right.
It's not theirs. It's international, just the way the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean are international. And I think we should insist on that. We want fair trade. Now, again, I think they should be running a trade surplus with us, a huge one, but it should be fair trade.
Right.
It shouldn't be by these things they do that are cheating and are not acceptable to the WTO. We want nuclear security. That's up to us to try to enhance our own security measures using our own technology. And we insist that we have democratic values. We're free people and we want a democracy. So those are all things that we need to have. So then the question is, where is it perfectly reasonable that the two powers compete over the next 50 years?
Right.
Well, in international trade, they will compete. It needs to be fair competition, but compete. And we've got an advantage with technology. They've got an advantage with cheap wages.
Right.
Even though their wages are going up fast. On international technology, we should compete. They want to make medical devices. We want to make medical devices.
Right.
Fine, just so they don't steal our patents.
RIP, right.
Alliances. They should be able to have an alliance with whoever they want. If they want to have an alliance with Pakistan or with Russia, there's nothing we can do about it, although we could try to get along with Russia or Pakistan so that wouldn't happen.
Right.
Because we have alliances all around China. So we have an alliance with South Korea, with Taiwan, with Singapore, with Malaysia, and with Australia, and with Japan.
Right.
So they're looking at nothing but the United States.
Right.
Where can the two countries cooperate? This is harder. Climate change is the obvious. We're the two biggest polluters. We've got to take a leadership role in climate change.
Right.
Crisis and disease control, we can work together, and we should. They've got problems right now. Their pigs are all dying and whatnot. We should try to help them deal with that. The drug trade, they should stop sending us fentanyl, and we should stop allowing it into the country. Peace, we we're cooperating with North Korea, but that sort of seems off right now.
Right.
Iran, we had a cooperative deal until Trump pulled out. It
Right.
wasn't the Chinese that pulled out.
Right.
And global sustainability, keeping the global environment from absolutely imploding. I just think that we ought to think about they're going to do some things that are reasonable for them. We're going to do some things that are reasonable from us. Those things conflict, but they're things that are necessary for both. And then the other things we can fool around with.
We have some wiggle room.
Yes.
Essentially. And one thing underlying this and a lot of the reading that I went over was the importance of alliances.
Yes.
Right? And it seems, at least in the current administration, there's a lot of skepticism about alliances. Can you talk about how we can use them and how they've been useful?
Yeah. So, again, the current administration has made life difficult for the Japanese prime minister with steel and aluminum tariffs, among other things, and the threat of automobile tariffs.
Right.
He's completely alienated the Europeans. So the Europeans are not working with us on China now,
Right.
whereas they were before, 2 years ago.
Right.
Australia is a nice ally, although he alienated the Prime Minister of Australia his first day in office by
Right.
hanging up on him. If Latin America, South Africa, India, Australia, and the South Asian countries were all together, China would have to behave.
Right.
It would have no choice.
Right.
It would have the Belt and Road countries, but that's Pakistan,
Right.
and Afghanistan, and Myanmar,
Right.
and places you don't want to visit, Kazakhstan,
Right.
Uzbekistan,
Right.
and so they would behave, and they could behave
Mhm.
because they're doing great
Mhm.
economically,
Right.
And they're
There's a lot of ways for them to do well without any of this cheating.
and he's
or
now
problems,
in
right?
apparently for life as of last year.
Mhm.
So there's no reason for the two countries to be at each other's throats other than the stupid trade war right now and the South China Sea thing.
Right, right. So the pie is sort of big enough for both of us
Yes.
if we know how to divide
If we
it.
just divide it up and,
Right.
and
And even grow it.
yes,
Right.
and grow the whole pie.
Right,
That's a
right.
great way to put it.
Right. Well, Dick, we have had minutes and minutes of really interesting discussion. I want to thank you a lot for taking the time to share your insights on China. Thank you
Great.
so much.
You bet. Thank you.